Hello, this is Pete from Euro-Versy, and here's part two of our Euro-Versy debate on fandom within the Eurovision Song Contest. Britain, when they did their You Decide, I believe OGA had a role in shortlisting the songs. I think the Irish national final last year had someone from Wiriblogs on the judging panel. I think there's been other national finals where fans have sat on the panels. Is it right that sort of small numbers of fans get into these quite privileged positions? How can you embody an entire sort of fandom and what an entire fandom thinks in perhaps one or two people? Does it matter? Or does it just add another voice to a judging panel?
If you think of them as just juries, I don't think it makes any difference. It's like if they're not just fans, but they're juries. Like you can say like there are also other music experts. Why these five people? I feel like I just don't want to gatekeep and people, including juries. No one's like objective all the time. Like you can see like juries having like wild opinions from other juries from the same country. Clearly, even juries can be subjective. I don't see why it's a problem with fans. Although, if I'm not mistaken, Romanian national final it was with like lots of fans. It became sort of like a disaster. I'm not so sure. I don't know about like the more recent years, but if anyone knows, please shed a light on it.
I mean, I would say that having fan participation is pretty crucial, and we might want to think about what that looks like. But I think something that's been so important for me in basically everything music related I do is this thing that I feel strongly about has typically been viewed and analyzed and critiqued by people who aren't part of it. And that never sat right with me. And that goes for Eurovision, it goes for record collecting. It was always that motivation of we need people who know the culture, know the fandom to actually have a part in it as well. So I think we need fans there, but how, when, where, I don't know.
I think part of it is again, I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but we come to a determination as to how do you select who does what. And I think, I don't want to sort of name names or anything in particular, but when you think maybe 10 years ago, there was Paul Jordan, who was Dr. Eurovision, and he was invited on into the semi-finals. And he was there because he had a PhD in Eurovision. That was his specialist expertise. And so, you know, he sort of perhaps earned the right to be there. I suppose you're right that does your expert jury on national finals, does it have to be a local record producer and a local choreographer and whoever, or actually should it be fans who sort of understand the mechanics of what goes on and they know what might do well and what might not do well? The reverse of that is, do fans then say, well, this is what I think will win the contest, and that means that we narrow the sort of selection of music?
I mean, I would say you obviously need a diversity of fans. And some of those fans might be professional in terms of working in the music industries as well. But I think to answer that question, you also need to think about what is the point of the competition? Is it about building a community or is it about getting a number one record? And I can see that Patrick has his hand up as well.
Yes, indeed, I do. Funnily enough, I stumbled into this space rather by accident, but it is actually, funnily enough, quite a topic that I have been somewhat fascinated by.
That is disappointing for the concerted advertising campaign me and Veronica have put on for the last week.
No, that's all right. No, as I said, it's actually probably quite opportune that I've stumbled upon it.
So yeah, welcome anyway.
No, thank you very much. Basically, as I was saying, it's Eurovision and its fandom is something that has something that I've had a bit of a sort of an intimate involvement with, especially over the last few years that I've been living in the UK. As you can probably tell by the accent, I'm from Australia originally, so we have our own unique relationship with Eurovision, as you can probably tell. One of the things I found initially is when I first arrived when I first came to London to live, because I'd been into Eurovision quite a bit over the years I'd been living back home in Oz, but then actually discovering this active Eurovision community, again, almost by accident, one night when I went to the Swedish church when they were playing Melodifestivalen. And it was very, very welcoming. It was very... it was like they kind of embraced you. They said, "Oh, hi, welcome." It's like, "Where you from?" and all of that. And I don't consider myself a hardcore fan. I'm not one of those people who could says, "Well, I know that this song scored this many points back in the 1963 contest," or one of. I'm not one of those like really like uber fans. But I do enjoy I do enjoy Eurovision. I do enjoy it a lot. But I think one thing that I did sort of start to discover very quickly, and I think someone did mention this a few moments ago, was this some sense of entitlement, particularly amongst the sort of the more established Eurovision fans who have been around for years and years and years. And particularly when you come into some of the OGAE groups and you are a new person, you are very sort of trepidatious about sort of like making yourself known, introducing yourself, but making sure you're not wanting to make any wrong moves. Because because as much as the Eurovision community can be very welcoming, at the same time it can also be very cliquey, and that is a very that can be a potential downfall. And for me, being someone who is autistic, socializing is challenging enough as it is, without having to negotiate this additional minefield of like what's appropriate to say and what's not appropriate to say. And I'm someone who can speak their mind quite a fair bit, and sometimes I have spoken my mind out on various things, only to sort of be told off and say like, "Oh, how dare you say that?" Or you just get some very snide remarks, and people just kind of talk down to you and just make you feel like the smallest person in the world, all because like you got a stat wrong about a particular contest or something like that. It is cliquey. It can be also quite competitive as well. And again, I know that like outwardly, a lot of the Eurovision community, particularly in the UK, can be very sort of can seem quite welcoming, but unfortunately, my experiences, particularly in more recent years, especially around the time of COVID, they kind of sort of gave me a very vastly different impression. They gave me a completely different perspective, to the point where I actually found myself backing away from a lot of the from a lot of the community, a lot of the fandom, and it kind of just made me realize, you know what? I really don't need to feel part of a community to enjoy Eurovision. I mean, Eurovision is there as a contest because it's got good music, it's got good staging, it happens every year. It's like, yeah, sometimes it's good to enjoy it with other people, but I think as long as you're enjoying it internally, nothing else really matters. And yeah, and I'm sorry, I've rambled on a little bit there.
No, absolutely not. I mean, first of all, thanks for sharing that with us, because you've said a lot of very honest things there. You've shared a lot of some not very nice things and some very good things. So no, first of all, thanks very much for sharing that with us. The stat thing, I mean, I had that weird anxiety too. I remember, again, one of the first Eurovision events I went to was a pre-Lisbon drinks in a pub, and I did sort of think, oh, weird. I mean, it probably says more about me than it does about the fandom. But sort of weird anxieties that I was going to walk in there and someone was going to ask me to rank my top Finnish entries or whatever, and things, and it wasn't. It was just people talking about what they like and stuff, and actually with a few people finding common grounds that weren't even to do with Eurovision. But I can appreciate that there can be that sort of, there's always the potential of like, oh my god, you like that, or what have you.
Yeah, there's actually like something else that just came to mind as you were speaking there. I think one of the things that I also experienced, especially within sort of like the UK Eurovision community, is especially the way that they do look down upon newer people, and I think this is something I wanted to try and say before, in the sense that. As a new person, you're inevitably going to come up with questions about ticketing for the contest next year, accommodation, all of the standard sort of FAQs in a sense that any new person's going to ask. And sometimes I actually on a Facebook group once I actually saw one of like some of the more established members, for lack of a better phrase, basically bemoaning the fact it's like, oh, why do all these newbies always ask these questions? It's just so stupid. And I basically just went in and sort of gave it to them with both barrels. I said, look, how dare you? You were new once. And I just like you need to pull your freaking head in, and just respect the fact that everybody is new once, and like it is an honest question. We should not be treating people this way. We should be as welcoming as possible, and trying to help them out as much as we can. Yes, sometimes it does get frustrating. It's like, but we hear the same question every year. Well, you know what? You're going to hear the same question every year for all eternity. You know what? So just deal with it, and actually Sorry, go on.
I think you can extend that point. We talked about this a little bit earlier on about the way we interact with non-fans or casual viewers. That every year I will get, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. Didn't Steps take part once? Or we should get Adele to do it? Or don't you have to be an amateur singer to take part? And all these weird misconceptions. It's all political anyway. It's all rigged. Or those. And I think. And I remember people saying, "Oh, I love Europe." My mate, she's a massive Eurovision fan, and then you explore it, and it's like they have a Eurovision party on a Saturday, and that is being a fan. That to them, that is being a fan. That on a Saturday night, they for one day a year, they get dead excited about a 4-hour TV program, and then they carry on with their lives, and that is a fan. But when someone says to me, "Oh, they're a huge Eurovision fan," I'm in my head, I'm like, "Oh, we can talk about our favorite song for Europe or whatever," and then it turns out they don't, and there is that sort of mismatch and disconnect between the two. And it's not that they're right and I'm wrong, it's just that there's very different levels of fandom. But in terms of people
no, go on, finish your point.
No, it was just that in terms of people getting annoyed at answering the same questions, you're exactly right that I spend many minutes of my life explaining why Steps haven't taken part and why you can be a professional singer.
Yeah, and it's the same with me, like being Aussie, and I get asked all the time, why is Australia in Eurovision? And you know what, as much as people...
And it was Israel prior to that, of course. Veronica?
Yes, so I'm trying not to kind of geek out too much on academic theory, but I find it really exciting because what we're actually talking about is the form of cultural capital. So who has more capital and who is willing to share that with others? And in this case, it might be who remembers these obscure acts and who can share the knowledge of when our tickets being released. And it's such a way that we kind of read and grade fandom in a way that we kind of understand of who is somehow in charge, the leader of this community, a group of people, is we look for the one with the kind of the most cultural capital. And I think when we talk about elitism and things like that, the reason why it's difficult to identify, well, when is gatekeeping happening in Eurovision? How is it happening? Is because we're still trying to identify what does cultural capital look like in this setting? So again, if we think about record collecting, it's more tangible in its who has the first pressing, who has the most pressings. With Eurovision, it could be, do you remember the 1960s entries? Do you remember the 2000? Like where do we kind of identify that? And that's where it gets confusing and very exciting.
Can I just pick up on something Patrick said, if that's okay?
Of course you can.
Yeah, so something Patrick said there resonated with me about how I do feel like, for example, you do feel like there's a certain groups of fans. And when I was asked to edit Vision It was one thing that was very, very, very much at the forefront of my mind. And I was conscious of the fact that even with the best will in the world, because whenever anybody's involved in magazines, especially ones on a voluntary basis, will tell you, just trying to get people to do anything for it can be tricky. But one thing I really, really, really tried to do, and I'm not sure how successful I was with Vision, was to get as many faces and voices in that magazine who you wouldn't necessarily read about on a Eurovision blog or hear about on a Eurovision podcast. I wanted to reflect that the fandom in this country is diverse and can go back decades. And I think one of the things that I hope really exemplified it was a piece that I think really, really worked. And we basically just put the question out there in an email: what was the first Eurovision record you ever bought? And the response was absolutely overwhelming. And we had emails coming back from people going back as far as the late 50s of how they'd heard a song at Eurovision and they wanted to go and get it. And that to me was what I really, really wanted to do for a magazine that represented the UK fandom, was to represent as many fans as possible, because I can understand what Patrick's saying. Sometimes you do feel you're just hearing the same voices and seeing the same names again and again and again. And that's not necessarily their fault. It's just sometimes they're just the people who are accessible, or are the people on the list of who radio stations have to call for an opinion about Eurovision. There's nothing malicious about it. But as I say, I was aware that there was an undercurrent of that feeling around fandom, that there only seemed to be about 4 or 5 visible fans. Yeah. And that's something that I really, really tried to do. And I just get as many pictures as different fans as possible, so that it really felt like the magazine was for them. Again, I don't know how successful I was, but
I feel used, Jamie.
But that something Patrick said that just resonated with something that was really a conscious effort with Vision magazine of what we really tried to do to make sure we tried to break that cycle.
Is part of the same voices thing? Is part of it because there are some people who work incredibly hard on making content. The people who work on Wiri blogs, the people who work on ESC Today. I don't know, because I don't read that many websites, which is pretty poor. But is part of hearing the same voices and getting TV appearances and things? Is that because they've put the work in, they put the graft in?
I think for some people it is, but I also think that to become like a well-known face in the fandom, a lot of it also comes down to how many events you're seen at, like just your general visibility, not just like the work you put in. Sometimes just being at like literally every single event in the Eurovision event in the country is enough to like become a well-known face. And you know, I think a lot of those events are often down south, and you know, for a lot of people that's not accessible. Like traveling from the north to the south, it's not accessible. So you know, things like that I think put you at a disadvantage.
People in the north are trying to sort of change that, and obviously with the contest being in Liverpool, hopefully there will be more things in the north, and particularly the northwest, to drag people towards it.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, in terms of just kind of media visibility, most places will have an established list of media-friendly people, both in terms of what looks good, but also the people who will say things that aren't risky or too risky.
I mean, I don't know who knows this, but I appeared on Scotland Tonight. Obviously, that only appeared on Scottish television to debate a Glaswegian fan who I think he's done a lot more media than I ever have. But I get the feeling it was just right place, right time. That they needed a Scouse Eurovision fan, and I was the best they could find at short notice. And I'm assuming that was it, rather than because anyone thought I was some amazing face or anything. Because I think at that point, you know, I wasn't doing anything. I resolved to make more content sort of in the weeks following. But I think you're right that there are sort of faces and voices and things. And again, if you look at the ESC, what's it called? Eurovision what's it called? The thing over COVID where we all watched old Eurovisions. There was some infighting about, well, who actually came up with that, and someone else had a similar idea a few weeks earlier and things like that, and stuff. And again, there was this idea that maybe louder voices won. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not passing any comment. I'm literally saying what I saw, what fights I saw happening, or what arguments I saw happening on Twitter at the time. I want to move on to the thorny issue of press accreditation and fandom. So, as a general point, and anyone can shout out, should fans get press accreditation?
I want to say something about this. So I've joined at the right point.
Hi, Chris.
I think. Hello.
You've joined at exactly the right time.
Good. I missed it, but I haven't. So my experience with my podcast, thinking about Eurovision, is
Good advert, Chris.
Yes, I'm always going to get that plug in. I've not had the best experience. I've never been boots on the ground press because, quite frankly, I can't afford to do that. I can't afford to take the time off work to go to wherever it's been hosted for 2 weeks to be there. And also, my podcast is not about the current show. It's not about news about the upcoming artists who are going to be representing the countries. My podcast is more looking back. But what I tried to do last year and this year was speak to artists via the online press centre, and I think it needs improvement for fan press like myself. Because
Chris, can I interrupt you for a sec?
Yes.
Can you just explain what an online press centre is? Because I'm not that clued up on it, and I don't know if anyone else is.
Yes. So the online press centre is very much like so you have access to watching the rehearsals and the run-throughs of the shows, and you can then also go access like promotional materials. You can see long online streaming of the conferences and the interviews they do, and you can also request interviews with the delegations and the hosts, the delegations, and the artists representing.
So you can watch things, but you're not there.
You're not there, and I think that is. I don't know what the solution is, unfortunately, but my experience on that has been negative, and I feel they tried to sort of promote it. It would be this great thing. I mean, over the last 2 years, I've put in probably, if I'd guessed, about 50 odd requests to interview people for the podcast and talk about their experience with Eurovision and their memories and stuff like that. And over those 2 years, I've had only one, and that was lovely Jendrik for Germany last year. So yeah, I've not had the best experience with being fan press. So next year, I'm not even going to bother.
Thanks for sharing that with us, first of all, because that's really useful. Because I'd heard of online press centres, and I assumed it was like a COVID necessity. But again, should fans get any press access? Should it be left to, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but sort of card-carrying journalists to come and cover the story, or is there a suitable level of fan press that should be able to cover the contest?
Yeah, I wanted to say that with regards to fan press accreditation, I think it all comes down to what is the value that you as a fan can actually add to the overall discourse of the competition itself. It's like if you're just being there sort of like as a glorified fan just because you want access to the artists or to the behind the scenes stuff, it's like, yay, good for you. But what is that going to mean for sort of the outside world who are relying on the reports that you give to help more inform them about what's going on in the Eurovision world? And it's not an easy question to answer, but if you have the experience and if you have the drive and if you're creative enough, you could come up with that USP.
Perhaps the devil's advocate isn't it better that we have passionate, knowledgeable people come to cover the contest, as opposed, and if I say something ignorant here, please tell me to shut up, but as opposed to, I don't know, a Guardian entertainment correspondent who has a preconceived idea of what the contest is, who and turns up just doing their job? Or is that the role of a journalist, is to get in a sort of Louis Theroux style way, is to get involved in what's going on, and to sort of embrace what's happening? And a good journalist, as if I'm qualified to speak on that, would be able to know what the questions to ask, regardless of not knowing the knowledge of the contest.
I've had a website for ages. I've never applied for accreditation because I know I wouldn't get it. I'm old enough to remember when the Saturday tabloids did like guides to Eurovision, and they gave their opinion on each of the songs. That was when they had like 18 entries. For me now, as a fan, usually at home, sometimes at the venue, the fan reports I find really entertaining because they give me an idea of the rehearsals, who's singing well, what presentation is working, what isn't. So that is the value that I get anyway.
I think with the fan accreditation, it's interesting because it's a really good question, and it's not really one that I've given a great deal of thought. But I think there seems to be that. I mean, you could say it's that saturation point to a large extent, but I think over the past few years, there's particular vloggers who I levitate towards, whose opinion that I value. So, for example, one of my favorite vloggers is ESC Tom, because he really gets into the crux of it. Sometimes he's a bit too full on sometimes, but for me, I like someone who will see something or hear something that I didn't think of. That's the kind of thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
If you see where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I didn't realise until I sort of started doing this was just how many podcasts and channels and things there are, because obviously there's the big names such as Weary Blogs and things, but I had no idea how many people, and Chris makes a really good point of trying to do something to sort of make your podcast or whatever stand out or to be different, and not necessarily to be a coverage of the contest. And when I was setting this up, I wanted to get into discussion of controversies and what people think about things, to quote Daddy Freya. And then I was thinking, oh, well, the Ukrainian videos have just gone out. I could do a reaction video, and then the Estonian entries are out. I could do a reaction video. And I was like, hang on, and I'm going to interview an old Song for Europe contestant next week. And I was like, hang on, whoa, what is your angle here? Because you've suddenly gone from wanting to discuss, have in-depth chat like we're having now, to suddenly wanting to try and cover every aspect and angle of the contest, and you realise that there are so many people who've already got it covered. Is there a reason?
Completely agree on that. Sorry.
Go on, yeah, go for it.
I just completely agree with that, because that's the thing I realised I've been doing wrong. Like the last 2 years, was like trying to get my way into sort of discussing the current one. I'm like, you know what? That is not me. It's not what brings me joy.
Yeah. I was like that when the Ukraine and the Estonian entries came out this weekend. I thought, shit, I need to do something, because if I don't react to it, then that's one stream of content gone, and I'll miss the boat, and no one will watch my channel because I haven't covered that. And actually, I just can't do it. And I've said this before. I said this earlier on in the conversation. I can't watch 35 national finals and quarterfinals and react to, the idea that Estonia got 20 songs. I mean, I can't. I did do reactions to the Ukraine, and then forgot to turn my microphone on, so it was completely pointless. So I just had silent video reactions. So I just thought there and then that this is not worth it. Yeah, thanks. But you can see it on TikTok for anyone who wants to see it. Is there a reason why fans shouldn't have press accreditation? And I'm talking about, I've heard horror stories of people who perhaps haven't quite got a decent journalistic training, sitting in press centres asking inappropriate questions of artists and upsetting them. And specifically, the probably most famous instance was Mahmood being asked about his religion as someone from who they thought was from North Africa, and it turned out they got his religion entirely wrong. Is that just poor research on one fan's part, or is this a common thing? And the other thing I hear sometimes is people using press accreditation just as an opportunity to meet artists and get selfies. Is there any truth to that? Is it, or again, we may not be in the right room to ask that, but
I think it's like I was saying before. I think the reason that a lot of fans do try to go for that fan accreditation is precisely because of that level of access to the artist. It's like, oh, I get to meet the artists. Oh, I get to see what's happening. I get to get all the behind the scenes goss. It's like they're not doing it for sort of professional reasons. They're doing it for more purely selfish reasons. And then that's where you kind of sort of have to take a step back and think, okay, what exactly are you doing this for? Like, are you wanting to be a journalist? Are you wanting to move into this kind of career, or are you just like an obsessed fan who's just trying to worm their way in through another channel illegitimately? So I think that's you do raise a good point, and I think I think it's like you said before, it's not every fan. Not every fan is like that. You do have some over obsessed fans, absolutely, but it's not everybody. And I think I think it is a bit of a fine line, and I think the challenge for any organizing committee for any Eurovision is trying to find what that balance actually is.
Just briefly, I mean, this is a sort of tangential point. Sorry, that came out wrong. Obviously, there was a bit of a hoo-ha earlier on this week about what online material could be taken for the Junior Eurovision Song Contest. I don't know if people saw that, but there was a bit of upset that you couldn't sort of film rehearsals, you couldn't take material, you couldn't use any of that material to try and monetize your podcasts or whatever. For those who read it, was this the European Broadcasting Union stopping fans from having access to material in favour of commercial broadcasters and providers, or was this the EBU trying to protect children from being filmed for YouTube? And I'm sure it's just not as binary as that, but has anyone got any views or thoughts on that?
I don't think anyone should be making money from their content on the Junior Eurovision, especially. They're children, and I don't think I feel it's a little bit icky, for want of a better word, to try and monetize content from Junior Eurovision. It should be kept quite a lot more pure than adult Eurovision.
And I think there's also the point as well that, again, precisely because they are children, if you're going to be filming rehearsals and then you're going to be reporting on those rehearsals and then you're going to have people critiquing every single thing, especially in a public online forum, imagine what will happen if those children actually saw that and they saw all these people basically bad-mouthing them and bashing them. That is psychological torture. And you should not do that to a child ever.
We'll leave that there because I don't know too. I don't do too much Junior Eurovision, but it was just a news story that sort of came up this week. I think the sort of final question I wanted to ask, because I'm absolutely aware of the time, this is definitely going to be a two-parter. Is the online world of fandom different to the offline world? Is going and meeting people a much more welcoming experience than squabbling over who should have come second in '83 on a forum, for example?
Basically, I think just to expand on my the points that I was making before on that, I think you've got the online situation where you've got people sort of squabbling over the various things. They're like the minutiae of Eurovision, so to speak. But in saying that, the offline world, so real life, essentially, it can, again, like I was saying before, it can also be quite daunting, especially to someone who is newer to that particular community and is a bit trepidatious about meeting new people and making sure that you're fitting in and you're not wanting to say the wrong thing or give the wrong impression, etc., etc. As I said, initially, I found the community I found them quite kind. And but this was for me. This was pre-COVID, and then when COVID happened, it really kind of changed my view of those communities. Like, it's like they were doing a lot of the online things to try and keep everybody connected, but then outside of that, it's like, you know what? No one's really sort of looking like I didn't feel like sort of anybody in the Eurovision world was sort of looking out for me or anything. It's like I just actually felt quite isolated to an extent. And I know that also at the time there was I think I found myself just getting frustrated by the online world in general.
If I could interrupt, sorry, my biggest frustration during COVID with Eurovision was when it got cancelled, and when when we were told that the songs could not be used next year, but the artists could. And at a personal level, I don't want to personalize this too much, but when I'm not doing this, I'm an intensive care doctor. I was there in COVID, and I knew that the Ahoy Arena was acting as a giant hospital of very sick people, and for fans to be shouting at the EBU, give us our songs back, was a deeply upsetting thing. But I don't know whether that's because the thing they were looking forward to most while they were trapped in lockdown had now been taken from them, and they were just sort of, we've talked again about the ideas of passion and enthusiasm, whether it was just down to that. But I found that a sort of very unsettling thing when Rome was burning, basically.
A lot of the time, a lot of people are kind of looking. I know that I found myself in a group where they wanted to talk about a lot of like controversy. It's like, what is your controversial opinion? I'm like, I don't really have a controversial opinion.
Do you mean like this discussion?
Yeah, I don't really have a controversial opinion. Like, except for example, like Euphoria is not my favorite song of all time, but like that kind of thing. But it's like I'm always someone that tries to look at things very sort of reasoned and very logical, and people don't like that. And I think I found myself getting shunned quite a bit because I was like, you know what, I don't really want to get involved in the drama. And I think that is one of the biggest things. Yes.
Just to interrupt, is that in the online world or is that in person?
It's both. I think it's both. I think there is a lot of I think there are certain sections of the Eurovision community that just basically are there for the drama, and it's just drama, to the point where it's like, you know what, I just want to enjoy the contest. I'm not here to get involved with all the drama and the bitching and everything. I just want to enjoy the music. And I think that's one of the biggest factors that kind of sort of made me move away from the general community. I just wanted to just enjoy the contest on my own.
No, again, thank you for sort of sharing, quite raw stuff there. I know, I'm sorry that you've had a sort of unpleasant experience in that regard. I know my experience doesn't counteract yours, but I came to Eurovision as a fan who did a lot of this as a solo activity and gradually got more and more involved. And as I said, the first time I went to I think it was the Ship and Mitre, Jamie, wasn't it? When I went there with some trepidation that, oh my God,
you did, yes.
And I went there with some trepidation that it was not going to be nice. That's not the right. That there may be a bit of bitching, or that my love of Scott Fitzgerald may not go down too well, and it just didn't happen. I had a great time, and I made good friends with people, and and again, Jamie was good enough to let me stand next to him and his partner at the actual grand final. So
yes, we gave you permission to enjoy Eurovision with us,
but only 2 meters away. So I hope it's a force for good, and I hope again, as Lily said, I don't get the chance to go to a lot of the southern-based things. I'd love to go to Eurobash at some point in my life, and I don't know anyone who's been there recently, but I hope the things that Patrick's raised are not happening there, and I hope when events come to Liverpool, as they will do, that people will be friendly.
Pete, could I say something about the Northwest group that meets up? Because I think
please advertise.
Yes, no, it's not to advertise it, but I just think I know there's been a few comments about how there's so many things in the South, but there are groups in other parts of the country, and but I do think maybe it might have to seek them out more than we'd like. But for the past 20 years, which makes me feel very old, there's been a group of Northwest fans that meet up on a regular basis. We're having our Christmas meetup on Saturday in Liverpool. It's the first time I've ever been able to say we've been able to hold in the Eurovision host city. But we meet up welcome. We meet up a few times a year, and we're doing that for years. And that's been the way I've made some really good friends. I mean, Scott, who's on this chat, he's a good mate, and that we've met that way. And Pete, yourself, that's how we met as well. When you came, as you say, that came to that first one, the Ship and Mitre, and I sat there with my laptop on my lap, trying to find everybody mentioned their favourite Eurovision song, and I tried to find it on iTunes and play it for them.
But again, Jamie,
it's just a lovely way just to get to meet, and even sometimes you just meet people like the same thing as you. It just sparks off different things. You don't necessarily have to talk about Eurovision the whole time. It's just a shared love that can spark a friendship about all sorts of different things. And I think that's an important thing. Where you say meeting in person is different to meeting online. I think online the subject tends to stay the subject, but offline, meeting in person, you'll find you just that conversation just starts going, and you just start talking about all sorts of things, and it's great. Yeah,
and I think again, you talked about how you try to include people in the newsletter, but actually by doing that round robin of what's your favourite Eurovision song that you did in the Ship and Mitre, that was a way of getting everyone to speak and getting everyone to sort of be inclusive and stuff, and it wasn't just sort of people being left out. And then I spoke to other people who it turns out work in the same trade as me, and then you find out people like you are Doctor Who fans like I am. So again, you're right that it ships beyond Eurovision. And actually, we'll finish on this little not very good anecdote, but when I was in the queue for merchandise in the Eurovision village in Lisbon, and the lad in front of me was chatting away, and it turned out he'd come from Widnes and he'd been to the same school as me, and it was just what are the odds of that at a song contest Eurovillage, that you end up striking up a conversation about your old chemistry teacher whilst waiting to buy lanyards. So I think we've covered. It's been nearly 2 hours. So I think we've covered an awful lot of material,
and we've had lots of new ideas for other conversations.
Stop it. Goes to bed, everyone. Good evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Night night.
Bye bye.
And we'll see you all again soon for another Euro-Versy debate here on YouTube. Good night.